Okay, hello, everyone. We are going to get started on our very exciting LGBTQ tobacco town hall event that is all focused on the wonderful state of Ohio. Although I feel like I'm really biased because I was born in Ohio, and so super biased about this one. But I'm super excited about this because this is obviously a very important topic and discussion. And I think there's so many ways of looking at this specific topic. And so, yeah, so we will jump right in. Maybe. There we go. So my name is Gabe Glissmeyer. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a project specialist at the National LGBT Cancer Network. And so one of my main projects that I work on is called Out Proud and Free. And pretty much what we do in that project is we do a lot of education to the LGBTQ community about our disproportionate use of tobacco and nicotine products. And then I also do a lot of consulting work with state and city coalitions to make sure they're passing equitable policies that include LGBTQ people kind of at the forefront of those, because we know that ultimately policies have a huge role to play in health outcomes and public health. And so super excited about doing this event and getting to talk about this topic. So kind of just an agenda for the night. So I'll introduce our wonderful panel that I'm super excited to talk to and get to hear their answers to all these really great questions. After that, we'll do a very brief mini LGBTQ tobacco history. That's mostly just to make sure that everyone's kind of coming at this from a similar angle and kind of knows, why we're talking about tobacco, because I know a lot of the times, I talk to people about tobacco and they're like, that's an issue from like 50 years ago. And it's like, I mean, I wish it was, but it's not. So we still got to talk about it. Once that's done, we'll go into the town hall portion. And that's where the panelists will share all of their wonderful wisdom with us and all of their expertise. And then after that, we will wrap up and we will call it a night. So some housekeeping reminders that I like to go over. So this webinar is recorded. And that's just so anyone who couldn't make it or had other obligations can also see it afterwards. Once this all gets wrapped up, probably tomorrow, I'll be emailing out the recording and then also resources that our panelists have shared with us. If you have extra questions, you can definitely use the Q&A function. And then after, either if we have time, we can definitely answer those questions. Or if there's not time, I can talk with the panelists afterwards and they can share their wisdom once again, and I can get back to you with those answers. And then something I always like to do, especially when talking about tobacco, is have like this really great disclaimer, which is that when we throw around the word tobacco a lot, but just understand that we're specifically talking about commercial tobacco. So tobacco and nicotine products that are sold, distributed, marketed by the tobacco industry, and not any indigenous use of tobacco. So that's something I like to just do just to make sure we're all kind of on the same page about what products we're specifically talking about. So now I'm going to talk about our wonderful panelists because they are fantastic people. So our first panelist is Michael Pastrui. This beautiful picture. It looks so like bright and wonderful. And I'm like, oh, I wish it was summer. So Michael currently lives in Meigs County, Ohio with his two partners. He is an Ohio University graduate and has worked at Ohio University's Alden Library as an electronic resources specialist since 2014. Michael is also a worker owner of Wisteria Event Site and Campground in Pomeroy, Ohio. In his free time, he enjoys spending time with his partners, Aaron and Paul, around their hobby farm, camping, gardening, and more outdoor activities. So if you have any questions about any outdoorsy things or farms like I do, Michael's the person to talk to. Our next panelist is Julia Applegate. So Julia directs the Equitas Health Institute at Equitas Health, where she leads LGBTQ health education and research efforts to improve the health and wellness of LGBTQ plus and medically underserved communities across Ohio and beyond. Julia holds a Master's of Arts in Women's Sexuality and Gender Studies and a Master of Public Health degree from Ohio State University. And then our last and final panelist is Dr. Joanne Patterson. So Dr. Patterson is a health equity scholar and behavioral scientist who conducts research to reduce cancer inequities among LGBTQ plus populations. Her tobacco research has a strong focus on regulatory science, so conducting studies designed to guide federal regulation of tobacco products. She is currently funded by the National Cancer Institute to develop health messages that effectively communicate the risk of using multiple nicotine and tobacco products, risk to young adults of diverse gender identities and sexual orientations. So thank you for all the great panelists for being here and spending your night with us. Sorry, I'm gonna apologize really fast. My allergies are bad. It is that time. So my eyes watering. It looks like I'm crying because that's just how allergies work. So yeah, so I'm very, very excited for these panelists to be here and to be chatting with us about their levels of expertise in this field. So kind of just a very quick LGBT tobacco history. This is definitely my area of expertise. So historically, I would say, the tobacco industry has tried to market to the LGBTQ community roughly for about 40 to 50-ish years. And they first kind of started by trying to make a gay cigarette. So it was a cigarette that was specifically supposed to be used by gay men. And it totally flopped. It was supposed to be a menthol cigarette. It just didn't do well at all. And what also didn't help the situation was that as a community, we just generally have not really trusted the tobacco industry because the tobacco industry has had a really long history of giving money and funds to anti-LGBT politicians because those politicians also happen to be very pro-tobacco policies. And so there was this huge clash. And so the tobacco industry has always been trying to figure out, how do we get queer people to buy our products while also making sure, that they make sure that their pro-tobacco policies also go through. And so this is a conundrum that's been happening since the dawn of time. And so what's interesting is that kind of after the 1990s, when a lot of protests were happening of tobacco companies, they were like, okay, we need to start making sure that the LGBT community knows that we're their friend and that we support them. So we start seeing a little more funds and donations go to LGBT organizations, to HIV/AIDS research at the time, to arts programs, because they were trying to kind of change their perception. And so what's also interesting is that we get to the mid 1990s and we get this marketing campaign called Project Scum, which stands for Subcultural Urban Marketing. And this was specifically to get Camel tobacco products into the LGBTQ community in the Castro neighborhood of San Francisco. And so they specifically wanted to go for the rebellious Generation Xers and then street people, so people experiencing homelessness. And what was really interesting about this campaign specifically is that they weren't really focused on, advertisements or marketing. They really wanted to go grassroots and say, hey, where are queer people hanging out? And if, they're at Pride, they're at this bar, like we need to be there too to get our products there. And so we start seeing stuff like this, where it's 2000, the year 2000, San Francisco Pride, and they're like, hey, you know what? Like, we have this lounge, like you can come and try products here. And a lot of these products, are very much flavored tobacco products, and not only menthol, but it's also, like the fruity flavored cigarettes that we had kind of during this era as well, before those got banned. And so they basically were trying to figure out, like, hey, we know that the community is meeting in these places, we need to go there and have our products and make sure that they know that we support them and we want them to have pride in themselves because we also support that as well. So then we started seeing some really interesting stuff with advertisements, especially in print advertising. So this is one of my, I say it's my favorite, even though that's probably problematic because it's a tobacco industry marketing thing. But I think it's a really interesting, I don't know, just like marketing targeting type of situation in that you have the exact same ad, it's the exact same year, it's just in a different magazine. So Rolling Stone is considered to be general population, so non-LGBT. And Out magazine is considered to be LGBT. And if you look at the Out magazine, or if you look at the Rolling Stone one, you have this presumably guy and this woman in the pool. And if you draw a line, straight line from like his eyes to an end point, it ends up on her. But then if you look at the Out Magazine one, you still have the guy, you still have the woman in the pool, but then you have this third person in the ad. So now if you start drawing lines, straight lines around, you actually notice that yes, he could be looking directly at her, but he can also be looking at the other guy. And so it's so fascinating because it's like this ad only appeared in LGBT magazines. It did not appear in any other Rolling Stone magazines, even though, yes, there's LGBT people who read Rolling Stone. So it's just so fascinating of like, these really small changes they make in print advertising to be like, oh, this is for our LGBTQ consumers. And then we see stuff like this. So using, rainbow washing, so putting a rainbow on something and suddenly it's for us, or talking about pride, or like being drama free. And then this is also only in a LGBT magazine. I think it was in Minneapolis and like the Twin Cities. So it only showed up for the month of June, and then they never printed it again. And so it's like, yeah, they kind of know like Pride is a very big month where we're trying to do things. And so they're like, yeah, we're gonna get our most bang out of our buck if we do it during Pride Month and we throw a rainbow on it. So this is kind of just showing like, how we got to, we really have a huge distrust of the community to the point where it's like, oh yeah, we'll totally allow tobacco industry advertisement in our local, very small LGBT magazine. And kind of how that distrust is kind of turned now into a lot of, I'd say like a weird level of like trust, but also still like the distrust at the same time. So yeah, so with that, we will now get into this town hall portion. Um, so I think what's really fascinating, so all these questions were really great. We got a lot of questions. And I think what's great is that, we kind of merged stuff together because a lot of it kind of fit together. But obviously, we know that there are many things that impact health for all people, but especially for LGBT people. And so this first question, like, what are the risk factors that cause LGBTQ people to smoke? Are they different than non-LGBT people? And then are there any differences for flavored products?
So I'm happy to chime in and start us off if that's helpful. I find this conversation about risk factors really fascinating because when you talk to people in our community, inevitably they will say two things most of the time. They'll say, I smoke because I'm stressed, and I smoke because I do it socially, right? And yet it's so much more complicated than stress and social smoking. I think about, when we think about risk factors, right? I think of a cascade. So what causes stress? Okay, well, we know that discrimination and oppression against LGBTQ people is part of those kind of bigger macro factors that cause stress. And we've actually found in studies that living in states where there are more discriminatory and oppressive policies is associated with cigarette smoking among LGBTQ people. So like, it's not just about stress, it's about what's behind the stress, right? We also know things like food insecurity. So experiencing hunger and a lack of food are associated with smoking in the general population, and have kind of qualitative work saying that it's also associated with smoking in the lives of LGBTQ people as well. So there's some similarities and nuances for what people say and what's actually happening behind it. I'm interested in, Julia and Michael, if you've heard some of those same stories about people smoking and stress and tobacco use.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. I can say, as a Generation Xer who was around when all this targeting started, it was happening in the tobacco industry and also in the alcohol industry. And there was, this Generation X also grew up knowing that tobacco products could kill you, right? So, but I think the allure of being seen by a company was just very powerful. And it, combine that with, like Joanne said, the stressors that LGBTQ plus folks feel and experience because of discrimination, because of the law, because of our lifestyles are outlawed, and thinking about where we could gather in the 1990s and prior, and maybe less so now, but that whole experience of finding your community in a bar and nightclub came along with cigarettes and tobacco products and other substances. Some of them are illicit, but certainly it felt like there was something that felt affirming about a tobacco company or an alcohol company seeing us. And so of course that's a mind, I mean, it's something that messes with your head when you also know that this company seeing you, that they're attracting you to something that's addictive that can kill you. But again, when you're living in such a heightened state of, I don't know, being an outcast, I think that got confusing for so many people, and then of course it's addictive. So you do it and then you just keep doing it. So it's just a trap.
Julia, I love that you're talking about that kind of dichotomy between the desire to be seen and the being glad to be seen, and then also having that kind of mind flip of, and yet I know that these tobacco indices are deceptive. And we have research, we have qualitative and focus group research in which people who smoke are saying exactly that. There's this great study out of Appalachia, which has some of the highest rates of smoking generally, but also among LGBTQ people, in which folks are saying, yeah, like, I know that they're not out for my best interest, they being, big tobacco, but in my communities, it's sometimes just so hard to be queer, right? And this is, they're investing in my community. They're giving me coupons, right? Because direct mail marketing and bar marketing and couponing is directed towards LGBTQ people. And this is a way for me to gather and cope. And people are holding that dichotomy.
Yeah, and my personal experience, because I am a smoker, I am still a smoker despite my best efforts and many failed attempts, although I have had longer stints of quitting recently that I've had in the past. So, woo. I remember my first time ever going to a an adult gay space. It was a gay club in Akron. I don't even know if it's still there. It was called the Inner Belt. I was 18, and I was so excited, but also so nervous. So nervous. I had never been in a space like that before. And I walk in, and I was with a friend, and I couldn't drink, I couldn't do anything else to calm my nerves. So like we went outside to the patio, and everyone out there was just smoking. Someone offered me a cigarette, and I was like, despite all my education and knowing that this is bad, like I am very nervous and maybe this will calm me down. And it did. And then for me going on, and I remember that night too, the Camel reps were there and they were handing out free packs of cigarettes. Right? Oh, just you get 2 free packs just for being here. Why not? And that was actually the first time I ever had a cigarette. It was that night. There was a lot of firsts for me. It was a wild night, and yeah, it became a nervous stress coping mechanism for me, and still is to this day.
Funny you talk about Camels. My wife actually shared a story with me the other day about just even 10 years ago when she was still smoking up until four years ago, I think. And it, Camel was doing the invite a friend, and we'll send you these coupons. And so like, wouldn't you know, she invited everybody and they invited her back. So they could get coupons, right? And Camel wasn't even a preferred brand, I don't think, for her smoking, but especially when you're in a community where we're dealing with things like higher employment discrimination and higher rates of being in jobs in which we're in the service industry as well. I think I talk with a lot of people who are smokers in our community, and folks talk about, right, like, I work at a restaurant, I work in theater, I get smoke breaks, I work at a bar, I get smoke breaks, I work at a factory. If I get smoke breaks, this is how I get a break, right? And that's important. And then add on like lower income, right? The couponing is really important to be able then to continue to smoke. It's a really smart intersection from the tobacco industry standpoint. And very coercive.
Something I've read recently was that for younger trans men, that smoking cigarettes is being kind of discussed and used as a way to alter the voice. So for someone who's, transitioning from female to male, if, again, thinking about lower socioeconomic status, access to medical care, all these things, if a cigarette is a pathway to a crackly voice that's got a more masculine sound, there's another way to affirm a person's gender identity through a cigarette that also has that perception of being, the thing that will calm you, that will connect you with other people in your community, all the while, of course, while it's trapping you in a cycle of addiction. I think the tobacco companies have just been, they're so wily, to have connected freedom and pride with addiction. And they're so correlated in that messaging. It obviously has worked with our community.
And Gabe, you asked if there were like specific risk factors that were different for flavored tobacco. And, I think the biggest difference is that calculatedness of the tobacco industry. They're smart. We know historically from tobacco industry documents that big tobacco has what they call graduation programs. And they design tobacco products so that people are introduced to tobacco that is more palatable, in which they're able to intake nicotine more easily, and that it's more pleasurable in a mouth feel and in a taste. And so when we think about flavored tobacco products, right, menthol is one of those types of tobacco. It's a characterizing flavor that is much more pleasurable to take in from like a combustible cigarette or an e-cigarette. If they're using the same thing with nicotine vapes, right? And they're using the same thing with snus and smokeless tobacco like menthol and mint, or other characterizing flavors like candy and dessert and fruit is really important. But they purposefully manipulate flavor along with things like nicotine concentration and the way that nicotine is delivered in these products. And so if you imagine kind of that kind of constituent, the constituents of tobacco, the tobacco product itself intersecting, right, with all of these other risk factors that make it more likely that LGBTQ people would smoke, right? It's a setup for young people to get introduced to using tobacco. I think the other thing that we talk about when we think about flavors is also thinking about quitting, right? And Michael, I get it. I'm a former smoker. I get it. I think I quit for about 10 years over and over again. We know that, especially when we're thinking about some of our electronic nicotine products that folks are using now, people who smoke combustible tobacco are turning to flavored nicotine products, so flavored vapes first when they're trying to quit. They're not going to a tobacco flavored vape to try and quit. And again, so there's this really interesting, right? A risk factor for using a different type of tobacco product is a flavor. If you're a combustible smoker going to a nicotine product, might be a good decision. It's reduced harm, right? If you're going to completely quit combustible smoking. So there's a couple of interesting nuances around flavors and kind of why people use them, and what makes them so challenging to quit also.
This is a super interesting conversation. I feel like it kind of bleeds into the next question, which is about, people's experiences like smoking or vaping, because I think people want to know, I think a lot of the times we talk about personal stories being like the most powerful, especially within LGBT health and within tobacco. I know, Michael, you kind of mentioned like your own personal story and like, having that Camel rep there, like handing out free cigarettes and using cigarettes as a like social lubricant to be comfortable and to, find your people and, really feel seen and accepted. And so, this next question was just about, people's experiences with smoking or quitting or vaping as well.
Okay, I'm happy to share mine. So I was an adamant non-smoker for most of my young life. I grew up in a family in a rural community, originally in England, and then moved to the US. And there was lots of high smoking in my very low socioeconomic rural community that I grew up in the UK. And most of my family members smoked at some point or another, except my mother, who had asthma and told us that every single day. So I was an adamant non-smoker until I got to college. And I went to college. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I was very stressed about that, and about, doing a good job. And I was meeting a community. I joined, like many queer people. I came out within my first year of college because I was in a safer place than my southern hometown that I was then currently living in, that was very anti-LGBTQ at the time. And I joined theater, as you do when you're newly queer and an extrovert. And everybody smoked and everybody drank, and I just picked it up. And I picked it up socially first. I think, Michael, kind of like your experience, someone offered me a hit and I was like, why not? Let's try it. And I think that combined with the stress of, I was working through college. I couldn't afford college without scholarships and working. First gen, right? Stressful about, like, am I actually going to graduate and get through? I'm in this social community where everyone's smoking, and it became a stress reliever as well as an ongoing social tool. When we went out, we had one bar night in the small Georgia southern town I went to school in. Middle of the week, it was one queer night, and everybody showed up. Everybody smoked. Indoor smoking was okay. Sometimes there were bar reps. There was often a lot of paraphernalia, so like coasters and things, even just with tobacco company information on it. And so it just was everywhere. Smoking was everywhere. And I still found, like, I didn't enjoy this smell. I didn't enjoy the smell on me. I was one of those people who go wash my hands after a cigarette. It was a little weird. I'd eat a lot of gum, or chew a lot of gum. But menthols was the first thing I smoked. I quickly transitioned to Camels, actually. I think it was a couponing issue. It was an income issue. And also I know a couple of the women I hung out with who were queer were smoking Camels. And probably I smoked socially and intermittently in response to stress for like 5 or 6 years, and then started trying to quit intermittently in that period. And I remember throwing entire packs of cigarettes away, putting them in the freezer, like anything to try and help me quit, except using evidence-based tobacco cessation, because I didn't know that existed at the time. And it took me a good 10 years to quit. I went back and forth, and then like relapsed later in life when I went through a stressful personal situation in life. But the defining event for me was actually, 2 things happened in my life. In my mid-20s, I was in a master's program. I went to school, and I was in a public health program, and I walked into this epidemiology class of 100 people. And the teacher was using one of those, like, here's a poll for the entire class. And it was like, how many of y'all are smokers? And there was like 5% of us in the class that were smokers in this anonymous poll. So immediately I'm sitting in the back feeling shamed. And then he went on to coach an entire 3-hour lecture on the ills of tobacco, from everything from individual level health to like how it affects global warming. And let me tell you, sitting through that 3-hour lecture was painful. I walked out early. I felt such stress about it, because I also was I was addicted to nicotine, right? And so like here, you like bad, but what am I going to do about it? Like I've tried to quit for years now. But then I was actually diagnosed with cancer. It was not a tobacco related cancer, but I was 25 and I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And I come from a family where a bunch of people got cancer and died by the time I was in my mid-20s. And I thought, this is it. Like, this is the point where I have to stop. So the combination of scary classroom lesson and cancer kind of was the final tipping point for me. I still did it cold turkey. It was really painful. I ate a lot of sugar. And I got cravings for years afterwards. I would be a liar if I didn't say that there weren't times still that I didn't walk into a bar or have a stressful day and not think about a cigarette.
Yeah, I feel you, Joanne. I too was very much just a social smoker until college. And then it became an excuse to get up from my desk and take a break from studying. For some reason in my mind, if I went out to have a cigarette, that was a good reason. I couldn't just stop studying for my own mental health. I had to have a reason to stop studying. In my dorm, because of how the buildings were set up, there was like we called it the smoker's bench, and there was always someone out there so you could socialize and talk and hang out. And um, yeah, the longest period that I had quit was for almost a year. And how I quit, I basically turned it into a game. Like I didn't quit cold turkey. I just pushed myself to like keep extending the time between cigarettes, or even not even to finish a cigarette. And that actually worked the best for me. Unfortunately, there was also a family tragedy, and it threw my entire world off. And that's what stress, anxiety, world is collapsing, or you think it is, and there's your old friend, and you can buy them anywhere, any gas station, any convenient mart. You know, I tried vaping. I don't actually like vaping. I I guess I don't know. I'm old school. I do. I enjoy the feel of smoking. And I know that's part of the addiction. It's both physical. It's uh, um, you know, obviously the nicotine, but the social aspect. And yeah, it's something that I continuously struggle, and I hope to complete. It is one of my goals this year, is to get back on that and quit. Because yeah, same thing. I don't like the smell. I hate the smell of it on myself. My partner also, one of my partners also smokes, and so that makes it doubly hard when uh, you have two people in the house. Um, and if one quits, you know, they're a little cranky, and it's easiest to quit together, and it's just never seemed to have lined up well for us.
Yeah, I think it's just, yeah, I feel like the shame-based approach, I think it helps some people, like a very small margin of people, like are very, can do behavior change based on shame and whatnot. But I think, you know, you've all said like this really, great things, and just like, like you can quit and then a stressful event happens and it's like right back to it. And I hear that all the time from, LGBTQ people that I work with, of like, I was fine. And then, my housing became like really tenuous. And then I started smoking again, or I started vaping again, or someone died, or like whatever. And it's just like, I don't know, it's just such a like social determinant of health, like nightmare almost, of like, yeah, when people don't have the resources, whether it's mental health resources or paid time off or safe housing, like naturally people are going to like not be able to quit. Like that just is like, it just makes so much sense. And then it's like you're dealing with nicotine, which is super addictive. And I've talked to people who are like, yeah, like I used to have a cigarette after like sex, or after like I ate a steak, or after, like when I would see this specific friend. And it's just like, in order to get rid of this product, that's so tied to rituals in their lives, they had to like change everything about their life. And then, I think at the beginning parts of like tobacco prevention world and like tobacco cessation world, we used to be like, yeah, just like quit. Like it's not that hard, but it's like, no, like this is tied to so many things that it's not just like like anyone can quit and like it's so easy to quit. It's like, no, this is a very tough thing to do, and it's a tough thing to also maintain and sustain too. I think also, speaking of tough things, this next question, which I'm super interested to hear your answers to this one, because I think it's really just like, I don't know, complex. I think within especially flavored tobacco products. But what role do you see, yourself, your institution, your career kind of playing in eliminating flavored tobacco products? I think one thing that's really great about LGBT health and public health and most careers and fields is that they're multifaceted. And so, something I like to say is like, yeah, if you're working in housing, you are also working like safe housing for folks or healthcare for folks. You're working in tobacco prevention, because we know that these things are tied together. So yeah, so what role do you see your institution or career playing in eliminating flavored tobacco products, or you yourself as an individual?
I'll take a turn and go first. So I work in health education, but situated in an federally qualified health center that positions itself as a safe home for people who are LGBTQ plus or living with HIV, for as a safe medical home. And I can tell you that as much as I wish our clinicians were focusing on tobacco cessation or harm reduction around tobacco products, they rarely get to that because there are so many other issues that people are dealing with their health. And so oftentimes the tobacco ends up being the last thing to be addressed, because it is things like, are you stably housed? Or, will your insurance policy cover your hormone therapy? Are you virally suppressed with your HIV? I mean, medical care, right? Everybody wants to chop it up into 15-minute segments. So if that's what you've got as a provider, and you've got clients who have lots of needs, and right or wrong, you're kind of, still left with this perception that tobacco can be a comfort for your community, then that's going to be one of the last things that you ever address. And so, I mean, I feel like, as much as I would love to see my institution be actively involved in tobacco cessation, I think in practice, what you see is that it just continually falls at the bottom of the totem pole, at the bottom of the pole.
It's a struggle for healthcare organizations because there are so many competing priorities and so little time with patients. I mean, I think you're hitting on something there, Julia. At Ohio State University, so I work in the College of Public Health, and I do some collaborative work with our Comprehensive Cancer Center, through which we also have a Center for Tobacco Products. And in that Center for Tobacco Product Research, there are folks working on all different types of prevention, harm reduction, and cessation kind of related research. I find this question really fascinating and interesting to think about with respect to my own work. So I entered the field to do LGBTQ research because I saw that there were, from what we could at least tell, disparities or differences, unequal differences in cancer rates and cancer-related deaths that are happening in our LGBTQ community and subpopulations of our LGBTQ community. And a lot of those are tobacco-related cancers, right? And that's because we still use combusted tobacco at higher rates in our LGBTQ community than in other communities for all the reasons we've been talking about. So when I think about part of my career and the part that involves regulatory decision-making and things like flavored tobacco products, my interest is understanding who in our community is using what types of flavored nicotine and tobacco products and why, because the why is important, right? So we need to understand how young LGBTQ people are entering into using nicotine and tobacco products. Is that through flavored products, and what types of flavored tobacco products, right? Are established smokers, combustible users, using flavored nicotine products? And are they using them to successfully quit? Is that part of the trajectory? Or if not to quit, to reduce the amount of harm, right? Someone might not have to quit nicotine altogether to have reduced harm if they stop combustible smoking and are only using like an electronic nicotine product or a vape, or even like snus or another smokeless product. They're less harm than traditional combusted products. So I think to inform any regulation, right, we need to understand who's using what and why, so we can have data that like informs those decisions and makes people think about the duality of prevention and harm reduction. Both are valid, especially in our community. And then the other part for me is about access to information, and access to information that allows us to be put on an equal playing field. We know that the tobacco industry has traditionally, been coercive. We know that advertising continues to be coercive. So I'm interested in understanding, okay, are there parts of even things like advertising that we need to regulate, because maybe we're advertising products in a way that's more manipulative and has folks uptake flavored tobacco products or other tobacco products in our LGBT community at differential rates. And then finally, like educating people about tobacco health risks In all of our population level data, we see that LGBTQ folks tend to report lower tobacco health risks. So we perceive different tobacco products to be less harmful than non-LGBTQ people. And I think that's just because what's being told to us. That's how we've been marketed to, right? It's not any failing of any of us. And so, like, how do we give people access to the information that they need to make these informed decisions about their own health, right? It's not my job to tell you what to do, but it's my job to give you access to information and an evidence-based fashion. So you get to decide your own trajectory about flavored tobacco products, about flavored nicotine products, about anything that you might decide to put in your body.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I think it's tough is the answer pretty much to this. Like, you know, the role that you see you're in, if you see yourself in, your institution in, or your career in, I think the answer is, you know, if it's healthcare, if it's, you know, whatever it is, it's really tough. And I think it actually really plays well in this next question too, of, you know, how do you determine your priorities? When, and I think, you know, there's so much going on. It's like whether there's books being banned or whether, you know, there's reproductive stuff being banned or don't say gay bills. There's just a lot of stuff going on. And, you know, obviously you all have your careers, but you all are also human beings with personal lives. And, you know, like, how do you know, wake up, you know, what do you do when you wake up and you're like, okay, it's another day and there's all this stuff going on? Like, how do you even begin to prioritize everything?
I'm seeing Julia exhale, so I'm laughing a little bit because I just saw that big exhale, and that's what I was feeling like I needed to do, right? Well, I think first thing in the morning, I pet my dog. That's how I start managing.
It's a heavy load, right? I mean, it's every day, all the time. And I was just part of a panel conversation last week at our state house here in Ohio, it was all designed with good intentions, but I'm sitting there in our state, in the building where the legislators determine what I do and don't get to do. And it's just infuriating, you know, because the constant assault on our lives, it's terrorizing, you know, that's what I said last week. It's terrorism. It's just these legislators, they are terrorizing us and the people that love us. I mean, I identify as a lesbian and genderqueer woman, and, you know, it's just non-stop. And so, like, for me, I'm not somebody who's ever smoked. I grew up with in Appalachia with a mother and a grandmother who smoked, and my grandmother had emphysema, and I just, for me, it was just, I thought it was disgusting. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. And so that became like a protective factor for me. I did every other thing that I'm at risk for as a lesbian. But the smoking, I just never got into. And as somebody who has children, I mean, what my kind of take on this is to just talk openly about the fact that these tobacco companies are coming to get us. You know, that's their whole mission. They have to convert us to addiction in order to keep themselves alive. And so, you know, I think it's about talking as much as openly as you can about what the dangers are, and then remembering, like Joanne said, that harm reduction is a piece of prevention. And so for the people I know in my life who do smoke, is trying to remind them, if they're ready to quit or curb or whatever, that there are LGBTQ friendly resources that can help them. So they don't have to do it alone.
Yeah, but I liked what you said earlier about, you know, if you work in housing, you're also addressing things like flavored tobacco or tobacco inequities, right? I mean, so part of my work is regulatory science, right? It's designed to inform communications and policy decisions that could be used by FDA Center for Tobacco Products. The other half of my work is trying to understand how folks in our community, our LGBTQ community, experience food insecurity, and hunger, and lack of access to to food, to benefits that will allow them to stabilize their food security in their households, because we know it's related to tobacco, right? So like, how do I balance priorities? Partly for me, I engage in one line of research that I think it is more fundable, which is something I have to worry about, like as a researcher at a public university. And I simultaneously try to do community engaged work like I'm doing with Equitas, and work that's designed to address like those social determinants, right? Because part of my heart knows, my heart, my head, my soul, we have to address these upstream factors, right? We have to address housing, we have to address food, we have to address employment, we have to address structural discrimination. And it's a lot to take on at once. So like, I talk about like, I have parallel lines of work that eventually will come together to help hopefully add something good to the world, and put our community on an even playing field, by giving us the access to the things that we need, right? Like food, and also just helping to reduce the coercion that tobacco companies can get away with. But it's hard to balance, and I pet my dog and walk my dog a lot.
I feel you there. I mean, one of the first things I do every morning is, number one, I make coffee, and then I have to, I guess my personal therapy is feed all my various animals, and just get a little moment outside to enjoy, you know, these creatures that depend on me for their well-being. But yeah, it is exhausting right now, isn't it? Wow. I personally, you know, I do what I can for, I'm not in the healthcare profession. I'm not in the health field really at all, except maybe indirectly in my job when I am helping order and do selection processes for resources for our library. But you know, I'm a queer man in Appalachia in a triad relationship in a very conservative area. I mean, I don't want to say it's just about survival for us, because I mean, I don't personally feel threatened, but I think there's a lot more to worry about and things that we can tackle that I can personally tackle. And especially, I mean, in my personal view, and please anyone correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like as long as I have been here, because I remember growing up and it was like anti-tobacco this and anti-tobacco that and blah, blah, blah. And it seemed like as I noticed that when we as a community also started to tackle other substance use disorders, or started to focus more on, you know, heroin use or meth, or, you know, it's kind of like, that's worse. And like, kind of like what Julia was saying, like, let's focus on this and then we'll kind of get back to that, right? And, you know, living in the heart of the opioid epidemic, no one, I mean, it's a cultural thing, but I don't think I've ever seen or heard anyone admonish anyone for smoking. I have actually, once upon a time, I did have to discourage or tell a student to leave who was using chewing tobacco at the library. Because even then our policies were not super clear about tobacco use, which was quickly changed after I had informed someone about that. I was like, was I allowed to tell them to leave? This was kind of weird because they weren't smoking, they weren't vaping. But yeah, pick your battles. And again, you know, me and my family, we choose the best that we can. We choose to try to do the best that we can with what we have and to focus on our smaller network than larger. And we were just not equipped, I feel, to help as much as we would like.
I think, you know, Michael, you mentioned, right, the harm reduction piece, right? It's a really important part of not just our community's history, right? Coming all the way up through HIV/AIDS epidemic, right? And safer sex, and now into the opioid epidemic. So it's historical, and it's current, and it's important, and it's valid, right? It's valid to think about harm reduction as much as it is to think about efforts to prevent the next generation, right? Coming back to Julianne, thinking about your kids as well, right? The next generation of LGBTQ people from uptaking products that are going to lead them to regular tobacco use, right? We know flavored tobacco products, when people initiate things like menthol or e-cigarettes, with characterizing flavors like fruit and candy, that they're more likely to graduate to becoming regular users or users of other combusted tobacco products. So, right, I think we hold that harm reduction conversation and we have it and we recognize it's valid for folks who are already here, we're already smoking, we're already dealing with other concerns, and how can we move ourselves kind of down a continuum that works for us, while also like investing in these policies and kind of movements to prevent our next generation. And that's both like banning flavored tobacco and also making sure that they can go to school and hear about queer people, right? Both and.
Exactly. Yeah. I feel like, oh my gosh. Yeah. It's hard to figure out the priorities when everything feels so urgent and life-threatening. And I think, yeah, I really, try to think about it as like a ball of yarn of like, you just start pulling and eventually it unravels and you just have a bunch of yarn everywhere. But yeah, I feel like, people working in housing or food or honestly, Michael, like you with your farm and everything, I like love this farm so much already. I'm like, yeah, that is also part of health. Because, when people have access to, outdoor spaces and feel safe in those outdoor spaces, that improves health. And so, yeah, I feel like the priorities, it's like, whatever you can do is like great. Like whatever that is, like it impacts health overall for most people, which is fantastic. So I think this is our final question. So, because yeah, obviously, there's different ways of getting involved in LGBT health, whether that's research or becoming a clinician, or honestly, I feel like even with library systems, a lot of the documents that we have, especially around like tobacco stuff, like yes, we got them through the master settlement agreement, but they're housed within library archives. So it's like without that, we wouldn't even like know about a lot of this stuff. But what piece of advice would you give to someone that wants to get involved in LGBT health?
Well, I'd say, since this is an Ohio-based town hall, there are organizations in Ohio in multiple parts of the state, where you can volunteer, to, whether that is like in Cincinnati, there's a harm reduction program. They have a vending machine, and a vending machine for people who need to get those supplies. You can come get them at any time. And that organization that runs that harm reduction vending machine, they need people to help, fill the machine and stuff the packages full of cottons. And this is all about harm reduction for opioid use and syringe-based needles. But also in that machine, they put in safer sex kits. And so there's volunteering that can be done. I mean, I think we talk about the policy landscape. There are so many policies that affect our health, that because health is across the lifespan. And again, I mean, I think the stress is part of what crumbles our health. And so making phone calls to legislators, I think, is a good thing to do. I don't want to like try to take them all. So I'll stop there and pass the mic.
So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about tobacco and academia, right? Because I'm in both. So I think from an academic standpoint, if there are Ohioans out there who also do LGBTQ research, one, we should know each other and go for coffee. But there's also a sexual and gender minority research network that is also supported through the Equitas Health Institute. So that's something folks should know about if they're interested in connecting around LGBTQ health research. On the other side of research, for kind of all of the rest of us general folks in community. So one of the projects we're doing with Equitas, myself and colleagues at Ohio State University are doing with Equitas Health Institute. We're doing some kind of focus groups and listening sessions right now around people's experiences with smoking and quitting and trying to quit, who are also LGBTQ in our community. And so we do have focus groups happening that'll be going on through the summer. And the point of those is that we're actually working with our Department of Health. They fund Equitas Health Institute to educate our community of providers about how to support LGBTQ people who want to think about quitting or moving down the tobacco harm reduction spectrum, and we want to make sure that they're educated appropriately and also have the tools that they need to give to and support LGBTQ smokers who might want to quit or think about quitting. So join those focus groups would be the other piece. And then the last piece, I think, from my access to information hat on. So the Food and Drug Administration recently announced a proposed rule to ban menthol in cigarettes, and also menthol and other characterizing flavors in cigars. And I think one of the things that happens when regulatory policies are proposed is that folks in the general public get left out, right? It's a whole bunch of policymakers and academics and big tobacco that like get to comment on these things, but it's not true, right? Like we can comment as regular folks on proposed policies that FDA is putting in place. And so we are going to offer like a link to some resources to actually participate in upcoming listening sessions that the Food and Drug Administration will be holding on the proposed menthol and characterizing flavor ban. Those public listening sessions are important, and they are just as valid as the research that people will be sharing. So something I want to encourage folks to think about getting involved in.
My advice is similar to Julia's, which is, you know, research and look for a local or a regional nonprofit in your area. See if they have any events coming up. Send an email, see if they need help. I mean, having put on events, one of my other hats, not at OU, but in one of my, for the campground is, you know, I can tell you as an event planner and programmer, no one's going to say no to good help. And see if it's a good fit. Another thing, and to kind of build on what Joanne was saying, information literacy. Information literacy, I cannot emphasize the importance of this enough. That is understanding how to read scientific literature, understanding how to get access, like how to use your local library resources, or if you're at a school, how to use interlibrary loan if your school does not provide access. There's lots. It's going to sound weird coming from an electronic resources person, but you know, there's so much more information that hasn't been digitized yet that you don't even know. Could be sitting somewhere on a shelf that is just waiting for someone to request it before it's been digitized. So yeah.
Yeah, those are amazing pieces of advice. I feel like, yeah, the biggest thing is just like, if you want to get involved, you should get involved. It's like the biggest step, and not like maybe like the hardest step of like, you know, there's so many ways of getting involved. But thank you all so much for being here and sharing your expertise and your personal stories. You're all amazing. And I'm just like, how do I get to Ohio like yesterday? So yeah, so some of you touched on the resources. So yeah, we definitely want to provide people with resources, tangible things they can do. So if you're looking for cessation resources, there's always the Ohio Tobacco Quit line that you can call. If you want some extra tools and tips, Dr. Patterson shared the smokefree.gov website. They talk a little bit more about making a plan, kind of local resources a little bit, and then some other information about kind of just the impact of tobacco on your health. And then we also have this really wonderful resource from Equitas. If you scan the QR code, it actually takes you to the PDF file. And so you can definitely, yeah, I know, tech savvy here, even though I'm really not all the time. So yeah, so you can definitely use that as a resource as well. Julia, did you want to say something about that resource?
No, just I'm glad you're sharing it because it was designed really with the trans and gender diverse community in mind, and we're working on one that is more generally LGBTQ plus, but it's culturally humble in terms of visuals and language, and I hope folks will check it out.
Awesome. Yeah, I love it so much. I gave it to, yeah, so many people. And then of course, Dr. Patterson talked about the LGBTQ research that is currently happening. So the email is down there. So lgbtqhealth@osu.edu. And yeah, and then once again, this will also be going out as a link in an email with the recording and everything. So don't worry about writing things down. And then Equitas Health Institute, you always check them out. So equitashealth.com. And so they provide tons and tons of resources. So definitely check them out if you need kind of direction on anything, medical, dentistry, anything kind of like that. Definitely reach out to them for resources in the area. And then local coalitions and listening sessions. So yes, the FDA menthol public listening sessions, they don't quite have the registration stuff up yet, but that's the website that all the registration information will be at. And then there's also the Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition, which is based in Cleveland. And so they're doing a lot of stuff around flavored tobacco and kind of just general tobacco stuff as well. And then there is a coalition specifically in Columbus, also working on flavor stuff. And so that is the email of the person that you can reach out to get involved in that. So luckily there's a tons and tons of ways of getting involved in Ohio. And then this is just like a final plug. So one thing, so I worked in LGBT tobacco for I think about 13, 14 years now. And one thing I hear all the time when I meet other people who work in LGBT tobacco is like, I thought I was the only one. And I'm like, no, you're definitely not the only person working in this. And so what I tried to do was create an online portal. So LGBT people, whether they're working in tobacco, housing, library sciences, like whatever, can kind of get together, have one place and kind of collaborate, share resources, share research, job opportunities, just in one spot. And so if you scan the QR code, it takes you to an application to get access to that space. And so, yeah, so that was something we made just to kind of, be like, yeah, we can talk about these types of things that impact us in one central location, as opposed to like, oh, here's another mailing list I have to be on. So once again, I think that's it. Yeah, so thank you everyone for coming tonight, taking some time out of your day. Thank you to the panelists again for sharing your expertise and stories with us. And yeah, this recording will be available hopefully tomorrow for everyone. So I hope that everyone has a good night and keep doing all the amazing work in Ohio. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.